EVO.
Welcome back to The Devil Within. In this episode, we re-enter a story already sliding toward its darkest point. But before we step into that house in Eustis, Florida, let's briefly gather the threads that brought us here. In Chapter 1, we met Rod Farrell, a teenager from Murray, Kentucky, who wrapped his loneliness in myth and performed his invented immortality with such conviction that others began to believe in it. In Chapter 2, we watched the formation of his clan. Charity, Dana, Scott, and eventually Heather, each searching for identity, for belonging, or even for escape, and finding in Rod a narrator who seemed to know how their stories should unfold. And in Chapter 3, we followed them on the road trip that would reshape their fate, leaving Kentucky for Florida, propelled by Rod's grandiose belief that he was destined to rescue Heather from a home that he had never stepped foot in. We left off in the stillness of the Wendorf garage, with Rod crossing a threshold no one could walk back across. And that's where we return now. This is Chapter 4, the double murder inside the Wendorf home. Stories of violence often lose their meaning because they're told in broad strokes. Numbers, dates, the impersonal weight of headlines. But this story has a geography to it. And before anything happens, it's important to understand the space itself. The Wendorf home was not a fortress. It was a typical suburban house, built for comfort and predictability. A place where laundry was folded, where dinners were made, and life passed with ordinary, predictable rhythm. There was nothing ominous in its structure, nothing that foretold the rupture that was coming. Inside that house, Richard and Naomi Wendorf were asleep. They had no protective instinct stirring, no sense that their lives were suddenly measured in minutes. The night was quiet, in the way only suburban nights can be. Wrapped in the hum of appliances, the soft settling of a structure cooling after dusk. The safety that comes from assuming tomorrow will look and feel exactly like today. Into that stillness stepped Rod Farrell. He entered through the garage. He later claimed the door had been unlocked, though whether that's true or simply another part of his shifting story no longer really matters. What does matter is that once inside, he paused. And this is the part of the story where myth and reality collide so abruptly that neither survives intact. Rod believed he had crossed into enemy territory, the lair of oppressors, the domain of villains that he had sworn to liberate Heather from. But the house was silent. It was just a home, nothing more. He held a crowbar, heavy, steel, it was cold. There's something profoundly chilling about the simplicity of that object in a boy's hand. It wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't mystical. It wasn't evidence of ancient lineage or dark ritual. It was a tool from a garage, used millions of times a day across America to pry open stubborn doors or loosen warped floorboards. But tonight, it'd be used for something else. Rod walked through the kitchen and then the hallway. In interviews he gave months and years afterward, he described this moment as if he were acting out a prophecy, as if the air were thick with cosmic instruction. But strip away the theatrics, and what you're left with is the truth. A 17-year-old boy walking through a stranger's house with a weapon, convincing himself that the people he was about to meet were obstacles, not human beings. He found Richard Wendorf first. Richard was asleep on the living room couch. He'd fallen asleep there watching television, as countless parents do. I did it last night. There's a devastating ordinariness to that image. The remote nearby, the blanket still on the armrest, the soft rise and fall of someone in deep slumber. Rod claimed that Richard woke up, startled, and reached for something. But the physical evidence contradicts that, because Richard had no defensive wounds. he never got the chance to react. The first strike landed before consciousness returned. And then the second. And then several more. Look, a crowbar doesn't allow for ambiguity. It crushes, it breaks, it obliterates. By the time Rod stepped back, Richard's face and skull were shattered beyond recognition. The violence was total, was comprehensive, the kind that only happens when someone decides to go further than freaking necessary. Further than human. Further than anything the fantasy could possibly explain. Rod stood over the body for a moment. I don't know, maybe he admired his own brutality, maybe he was feeling powerful, maybe he felt nothing at all. That ultimately is something that no court or no psychologist, no documentarian has ever fully answered. Naoma Wendorf was next. So Rod moved down the hallway toward the master bedroom. Now, if there was ever hesitation in him, it didn't last long. So he claimed that she lunged at him. Again, evidence completely disagreed. She was found lying in bed, struck repeatedly. The first blow stunned her, the next several ended her life. This wasn't rescue. This wasn't liberation. This was a teenager performing murder as if it were theater, except that these consequences were real and irreversible and unimaginably brutal. Then silence returned to the house, but it wasn't quite the same silence. It was more like a vacuum, a ringing absence, the kind of quiet that only appears after something sacred has been destroyed. And then Rod washed his hands in the kitchen sink. He later said this casually as if it were merely a practical detail, but there's something haunting in that image. A boy rinsing blood down a drain while his friends waited in a car outside, unaware that the script had drastically changed. When Rod finally did return to the others, there was a calmness to him that unnerved even the followers who had been conditioned to admire him. He told them what he'd done. Scott Anderson would later describe the moment as surreal, like watching the plot twist of a movie he wished he could walk out of. Likewise, Charity and Dana were stunned. And Heather, depending on which source you believe, either didn't understand what had happened or simply didn't want to. The details may differ, but the truth remains constant and unchangeable. 2 people were dead, and 4 teenagers were now fugitives in a story none of them understood the cost of. They piled into the car. They drove away from the house as if escaping an explosion, though the real explosion had already taken place inside of them, the shattering of whatever remained of their youthful innocence. So this is the part of the story where audiences typically want answers. Why did Rod do it? How could the others follow him? What switch flips inside a person that makes them capable of double homicide? But the truth is rarely tidy. Some people seek power because they feel powerless. Some people cling to fantasy because reality refuses to cooperate. And some believe their own myth so completely that they stride into catastrophe convinced that they're the hero. Rod had crossed the final threshold, and everyone with him had crossed it too, whether they realized it or not. This is Chapter 5, The Vampire on Trial. The morning after the murders, the Wendorf home no longer resembled the safe suburban sanctuary it had been for years. Police officers moved through the rooms slowly, almost reverently, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might disturb whatever terrible echo still lingered in the air. What they encountered inside was brutality without ambiguity. 2 parents bludgeoned to death. Their lives ended in a manner so violent, it startled even seasoned investigators. But the killers were gone. Across state lines, meanwhile, the vampire clan was drifting west in a stolen vehicle, unaware of the speed at which the world was closing in on them. They weren't criminal masterminds. They weren't fugitives with a plan. They were exhausted teenagers with dwindling money, no realistic escape route, and a leader whose myth had finally collided with reality in the most catastrophic way imaginable. In those first hours after the murder, Rod Farrell behaved as though his transformation was complete, as though the act of killing Heather's parents had elevated him into the immortal he'd always claimed to be. He bragged openly. He embellished details. he told versions of the story that made him sound powerful and decisive and unshakable. But this swagger masked something else: panic, wearing the mask of confidence. Scott Anderson saw it first. In later interviews, he described Rod's bravado as off, the kind of forced authority a person demonstrates when they're trying to impress their own reflection. Charity and Dana were equally unsettled. The road trip had begun as a dramatic adventure, but now they were trapped inside a nightmare none of them had the maturity or clarity to process. Even Heather, whose role in the group had been the emotional catalyst for their journey, appeared stunned, distant, and detached. She hadn't expected this outcome. No one had, except Rod. If the group had hoped to disappear, they lacked the skills to even attempt it. They used stolen credit cards. They stopped at convenience stores without disguises. They drew attention to themselves by behaving like exactly what they were: kids out of their depth. It only took 4 days for authorities to track them to a Baton Rouge hotel, where Rod was arrested without the struggle he once fantasized he'd deliver. Immortal beings, it turns out, submit to handcuffs just like everyone else. Back in Florida, the legal machinery began turning with remarkable speed. The press seized the case immediately. A vampire cult, teenagers driven by occult fantasies, role-playing games turned deadly. The narrative was sensational enough to outpace accuracy, and soon Rod Farrell was no longer just a murderer. He was a symbol, a cautionary tale, a headline. The truth, however, was far less cinematic. Rod wasn't the charismatic cult leader the media portrayed. He was a terrified 17-year-old who had built a mythology large enough to hide inside of. And now, sitting in an interrogation room under fluorescent lights, that mythology began to splinter. Detectives described Rod as cooperative, even talkative. He spoke in long, theatrical monologues, shifting between self-aggrandizing claims and dramatic remorse. At times, he insisted he acted alone. At other moments, he implied the clan shared at least some of the blame. He embellished supernatural elements. He contradicted himself repeatedly. And throughout it all, he maintained an unwavering commitment to the persona of the ancient vampire that he had invented. But the investigators were not interested in myth. They wanted motive. The prosecution's theory ultimately didn't center on fantasy. They argued Rod murdered the Wendorfs not because he believed he was a vampire, but because he wanted control over Heather, over the clan, over the entire narrative. The vampire persona wasn't an explanation. It was an alibi masquerading as an explanation. And the defense had few options. Rod's age made the case extraordinary from the beginning. He was 17, a legal minor, but the state tried him as an adult. At first, his defense attorney flirted with the idea of an insanity plea, but psychological evaluations, though noting personality disorders and emotional instability, found Rod competent. He knew the difference between right and wrong. Disturbed, yes. Delusional at times, possibly, but not legally insane. And the prosecution built their case meticulously. They highlighted Rod's own words, his shifting stories, his boasts during the escape, and the sheer brutality of the killings. They emphasized that neither victim had posed a threat. They noted the absence of defensive wounds. They showed the crowbar. They showed the photos no one forgets. This wasn't impulsive, they argued. This wasn't a rescue mission gone wrong. This was murder. Heather's role made things slightly more complicated. Ultimately, she denied knowing Rod had intended to harm her parents, and the state decided not to charge her. But the question of her knowledge and her influence on Rod's mindset hung over the proceedings like South Florida humidity. The clan's remaining members faced charges of their own, including theft, fleeing justice, and varying degrees of involvement. But for Rod, the path was different. The trial had become a spectacle. Reporters leaned into the vampire angle, creating an aura of supernatural menace around a case that was, at its core, a tragedy born of adolescence, delusion, and poor judgment. And Rod didn't help himself. He wore his persona like armor, answering questions with dramatic flourishes and referencing his vampire identity in ways that only cemented the prosecution's argument. This was a boy who believed his own fiction. He was convicted on all charges. At sentencing, Rod stood facing the court, thin, pale, his long hair falling over his face, as the judge delivered the decision. For the murder of Richard and Naomi Wendorf, he was sentenced to death. At 17, he became the youngest person on death row in the United States at that time. For a moment, the courtroom was silent. Not because justice had been served necessarily, but because everyone was reckoning with what it means to condemn a teenager to die. Whatever monstrous story the media had built around Rod, the reality was now inescapably human. Years later, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that juveniles could not be sentenced to death, and Rod's sentence was commuted to life without parole. He will grow old in prison. Perhaps the only way to measure the vampiric irony of a boy who once believed he was immortal. The other members of the clan received lighter sentences, their lives branching off into adulthood with the weight of their involvement pressed deep into the rest of their years. Some found faith, some looked for and found obscurity, some changed their names, but all were marked. Trials offer closure only in theory. In practice, they simply rearrange the grief. They assign consequence, but they can't restore what's been taken. For the Wendorf's other daughter, Jennifer, the trial did nothing to answer the questions that she'll carry forever. For the community of Eustis, Florida, the case remains a wound that hasn't fully healed. And for those who grew up alongside Rod in Murray, Kentucky, the story is a terribly grim reminder of how quickly fantasy can metastasize when left unchecked. Rod once imagined he was a creature outside the reach of time and law. Instead, time and law became the only things left to define him. Chapter 6. The Appeal of the Damned. Long after the trial ended, long after the reporters folded up their microphones and the public moved on to a fresher headline, the story of Rod Ferrell continued in the quiet, uneventful corridors of a Florida prison. This chapter isn't about spectacle. It's not about vampires or rituals or the performative darkness that once made Rod so magnetic to the kids who followed him. This is the chapter where the performance stops. Rod entered the prison system carrying the identity he had built for himself. Vesago, the immortal, the ancient, the predator who transcended mortality. But prison is the great narrative equalizer. The walls don't bend for myth, the guards don't care about lineage, and other inmates have no patience for theatrics. Whatever power fantasy Rod once lived inside evaporated the moment the cell door closed behind him. The state's case had been won, but the legal story didn't end there. In 2005, nearly a decade after the murder, the Supreme Court ruled that sentencing juveniles to death was unconstitutional. Rod's sentence, as stated, was commuted to life without parole, a punishment that, in many ways, binds more tightly than death ever could. Life without parole forces a person to grow older, to change, to evolve inside a story that no longer belongs to them. Behind bars, Rod softened in ways that made the earlier version of him almost unrecognizable. He withdrew from the theatrics, the claims of immortality, the persona that once gave him so much power. Time, in its stubborn, quiet way, began to do what courts and handcuffs never could. It completely dismantled the myth. But that transition wasn't immediate. For the first several years of incarceration, Rod still clung to the same fantasies that sustained him as a teenager. He wrote letters adorned in dramatic flourishes, spoke as if the trial were merely the first act of a longer supernatural saga. But eventually, slowly, painfully, he began to speak like a person rather than a character. Not because he found redemption necessarily, but because prison ensures that delusion has nowhere to hide. For the other members of the vampire clan, adulthood unfolded in fractured paths. Charity Kesey served her sentence and was released, later speaking publicly about the regret that shadowed her life. Dana Cooper was released as well, forever marked by the case, but determined to remain private. Scott Anderson, whose role had been the most tenuous, built a life that avoided attention. And Heather Wendorf, whose distress had originally catalyzed Rod's fantasies, she was never charged. But she carried the heaviest emotional burden of them all. So this is where people tend to look for moral clarity, as though the years might distill the events into something simple and digestible. But real stories don't offer that luxury. Rod Ferrell was not a supernatural creature, but he also wasn't a one-dimensional monster. He was a damaged kid who built a mythology around himself because the real world felt too small, too unforgiving, and too indifferent to his pain. And while that explains his delusion, it does nothing to excuse the brutality that he committed. The architects of tragedy often begin as architects of fantasy. And Rod's fantasy, once attractive to lonely teenagers searching for meaning, it just collapsed under the weight of reality, leaving only devastation behind. In the decades since the murders, true crime narratives have tried to claim the story for their own purposes. Some frame it as a cautionary tale about violent role-playing games. Others view it as a psychological case study. Some treat it as a gothic curiosity, an artifact of 90s angst and subculture panic. But the truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle. The vampire clan wasn't dangerous because of eyeliner or music or dark imagination. It was dangerous because a boy who felt powerless discovered that myth could be weaponized. He learned that if you speak with enough confidence, people will follow you. They will follow you into places they never intended to go. And he learned, far, far too late, that belief, once unleashed, can spiral into something that you no longer control. There's no arc of redemption here. Rod Ferrell didn't emerge from prison a reformed philosopher or a cautionary prophet. He's still locked up, serving the sentence that replaced the death penalty. And yes, he's older now. The myth is worn away, the persona replaced by the quiet anonymity of an inmate number. Whatever he once believed himself to be, immortal or destined, extraordinary, he's been forced to confront the same truth that all human beings eventually do. That we are accountable for the stories that we tell ourselves, and even more accountable for the ones that we convince others to believe. The tragedy of the Wendorf murders didn't begin with violence. It began with loneliness. It began with a teenager searching for identity and finding power in his performance. And once he realized that others were actually willing to follow him, the story spiraled out of the safe harbor of fantasy and into the unrestrained waters of reality. Every true crime case leaves behind a haunting idea, a single, lingering question that resists resolution. In the case of Rod Ferrell, that question may be this: how thin is the line between imagination and action? How easily can a story become a script, and a script become a set of instructions? Some people believe that Rod discovered the answer the night he stepped into the Wendorf home, crowbar in hand. But I think the answer came long before that, back in Murray, when a lonely boy found solace in the idea of being something more powerful than himself, and realized that others wanted to believe it too. The danger of myth is not that it's false. The danger is how deeply we need it. So now we close the story of Rod Ferrell. But the questions it raises will echo beyond this series. Stories like this don't end when the credits roll. They end when we stop mistaking narrative for truth and truth for destiny. Some tragedies are the result of a moment. This one was the result of a story believed too deeply by a boy who couldn't separate performance from reality, and by the friends who mistook his certainty for wisdom. If there's anything to take from this case, it's that belief, unchecked, can be the most dangerous force in the room. Next week on The Devil Within, we leave Kentucky behind and travel into another American nightmare. A story of rituals, disappearances, and the chilling psychology of a killer who believed he could hide in plain sight. A case where the truth wasn't buried, it was performed. If you enjoyed the series, don't forget to follow us on Instagram at The Devil Within Pod and at Evio Creative. And subscribe to The Devil Within on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. The Devil Within, along with all shows on the Evio Creative Network, are also available on YouTube. Rate and review. It helps more listeners find these stories. And share this episode with anyone who believes they know how stories like this begin. And please check the show notes for amazing deals from the great companies that support our show and still support long-form storytelling. Without them, we wouldn't be here. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is an Evio production recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Brandon Morgan.